Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to the Dean's Forum in Winter Quarter, which is sure to warm you in this somewhat cold room. Uh, the cold of dogs, I was just told, is an expression, but dogs are warm. So I think we need more dogs in here to warm us up in this wonderful setting. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful event. It's a pleasure to gather in Swift Hall for this Dean's Forum and to see so many colleagues, students, alumni, and friends for what I expect will be a timely and searching conversation. The Dean's Forum exists to create space for scholarship that helps us see familiar landscapes differently. Today's forum does exactly that by asking us to attend carefully to a place, a movement, and a moment that continue to shape American public life. We are here to discuss Will Schultz, Assistant Professor of American Religions. We're here to discuss Will Schultz's new book, Jesus Springs, Evangelical Capitalism and the Fate of an American City. Here in the hardcover, you have the soft cover over there. This book, a book that takes us to Colorado Springs in the decades following World War II, and its evolution into what some have called the Evangelical Vatican, and others more critically, as in Will's book, Jesus Springs. This book is not simply a local history, it is a study of how American evangelicalism embedded itself within what Professor Schultz calls the nation's spiritual economy, an economy shaped not only by theology and belief, but by real estate, federal dollars, military institutions, and political ambition. Linking the Cold War to the culture wars, Jesus Springs shows how a flood of defense spending helped turn Colorado Springs into the organizational heart of modern evangelicalism, even as the movement itself shifted from a focus on saving souls to securing social, political, and economic power. Here with us today is not only Will, but Margaret. Here with us today is, sorry, I skipped ahead. Here with us today is Professor Schultz, whose work combines historical precision with a keen eye for institutional life and political consequence. His book helps us understand not only how evangelicalism became what it is, but why its structures, strategies, and ambitions continue to matter. We are equally fortunate to have the other person here with us today, to have a response by Professor Margaret Mitchell, Shailer Mathews Distinguished Service Professor of New Testament and Early Christian Literature, whose scholarship exemplifies how careful historical interpretation can illuminate the afterlives of religious movements and ideas. Her response is sure to help situate this work within broader conversations about Christianity, power, and public life. Thank you again for joining us in Swift Hall today. Please welcome Professor Schultz, followed by a response from Professor Mitchell, and of course a response to the response by Professor Schultz, and then we'll open up for discussion.
Can everyone hear me okay? All right, thank you, Jim, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks to all of the people whose organizational work made this possible. I'm deeply grateful for what you did not only today, but what you do every day at the Divinity School. Thank you so much to Professor Mitchell for a comment which, to reveal some of the trade secrets, I have actually already had an opportunity to read, but which is wonderful and stimulating. And thanks, perhaps most importantly, to all of you for coming here. It warms my heart at a time when there is much need for such warming, both physically and spiritually, morally, however you might want to put it. To see all of you gathered here now, and for that I am now and forever will be grateful. just a few very quick words about the genesis and structure of the project. Quick, not least, because I want you all to buy this book and find out for yourselves. No, that's absolutely fine. If you don't, it's not like I'd make any money from it. Anyway, like most of the projects I start, this project emerged from some combination of peevishness and enthusiasm. Peevishness out of a sense that I felt as if the story of American evangelicalism was missing something, that there was too much an assumption that the things we think of as evangelical in the present have always been part of the evangelical tradition, which I felt slighted the importance of previous historical context in imprinting upon and transforming that tradition. The enthusiasm was the enthusiasm for that very peculiar place called Colorado Springs, which is there anyone here from Colorado Springs? Oh, wonderful. Welcome. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about it later, and I hope the portrait I've given here is not too dissimilar to what you have seen. It's a fascinating place, a place at the nexus of not only evangelical capitalism, but free market, sort of free market religion, of military power, of technical and aerospace might. My work on it grew out of a previous project on religion and the space race, and I have not looked back since then. And I suppose one of my takeaways from doing all of this was the realization that what seemed so unique and strange about Colorado Springs, the confluence of these factors, was really not so strange or so peculiar after all. The book has 5 chapters, the first ones dealing with the intermingling of economic and cultural factors which brought dozens, over 100 evangelical organizations to Colorado Springs between the 1940s and 1990s, and why Colorado Springs, explaining why the city was so attractive to evangelicals and why some business leaders in the city found evangelicalism so attractive. The middle chapters, the middle sections, look at the culture wars of the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, looking at these wars not as a description of reality, but as a slogan, a rhetoric, a way of mobilizing conservative Christians and others behind a specific agenda. And the last chapters deal with the United States Air Force Academy based in Colorado Springs and New Life Church, the city's largest megachurch, and how the ideas in both of these places, the ideas of America as a Christian nation and the idea of our world as being a battlefield between good and evil, light and darkness, demons and angels, actually bear the imprint of ideas from the Cold War era. And taken together, I hope, you will have to determine whether it actually achieves this, the book gives a picture of the rise and fall of a certain way of interacting with American culture, the evangelical hope, desire, dream of Christianizing the United States through cultural power and persuasion, a dream that I argue has diminished and given way in this era of much more assertive claims to evangelical political dominance. I will stop there. There is, of course, plenty more to be said. Professor Mitchell will say some of it. I hope we will have a chance to say a little more in the back and forth. And of course, I invite all of you to please, if you would like to talk more, send me an email, stop by my office. I'm just on the 3rd floor up here would love to talk more. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Mitchell.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dean Robinson, for the invitation to interact with Will's scholarship. I was reminded over the weekend that I actually did respond to a paper at the faculty retreat in January of 2023. So 3 years ago, it's our anniversary for that. And as Will has mentioned, I exchanged with him yesterday the written text of my talk, which is over 8 pages, and I won't be reading it all, but I'm going to excerpt from within it. And so I think we've set up for a dialogue in which I hope I will hit on the things that we were especially interested in dialoguing on together. As much as I did coordinate with Will over the weekend, I did not ask what colors he was wearing for today. So that is completely accidental, that the maroon-black combo is here. So, beginning. I have thoroughly enjoyed my time reading, poring over, and thinking into this superb book by Professor William Schultz. Schultz's historiographic investigation into Colorado Springs, Colorado, and its place in the economy and ecology of neo-evangelicalism, rooted in the period from 1943 to 1991, coinciding, as emphasized by Professor Schultz, with the Cold War in the international and United States context, is deeply researched, artfully designed, and evocatively written. In 5 body chapters, Will braids together key figures from lesser-known persons like Jim Rayburn and Alice Nedo Worrell to more well-known ones such as James Dobson and Ted Haggard. Events, local, national, and global. Institutions, the United States Air Force Academy, the Chamber of Commerce of Colorado Springs, evangelical church and parachurch organizations. Also legal cases, tax codes, electoral referenda, economic realities and indices, technological innovations, and other forces, including Satan and spiritual warfare, that led to and emanated from the mass movement of evangelical institutions to Colorado Springs, with more than 50 such organizations moving there from 1980 to 1995, gaining it such epithets as the, quote, Evangelical Vatican and, sorry, Chicagoans, if this hurts, the Little Wheaton of the West. Will's research deftly combines extensive archival research, attention to words written and spoken, including all manner of documents, among which are evangelical novels, focus on geography, topography, and placelessness, and astute interpretive analysis of the media, including the architectural design and final construction of the United States Air Force Academy's Cadet Chapel, called by Schultz, quote, an icon of Cold War religiosity. The book opens in the introduction with a framing device of 2 sunrise Easter services in the Garden of the Gods Park, 48 years apart, from April 12, 1943 and March 31, 1991, to demonstrate, and I quote, the changes in the city's religious demographics in this temporal interval upon which the book is more or less, I'm going to return to that point, focused. Schultz argues that the 1991 Christian worship service was marked by a changed tenor, now, quote, a distinctly evangelical tone, including, quote, intense, even violent prayer, close quote. The geographical focus of the monograph serves also Schultz's main preoccupation on continuity and change over some decades within evangelicalism. Will's definition of his subject, evangelicalism, meant, I think, to be a medial position within existing scholarship, is as follows. I think I need to read this so that we can center what our conversation is about. Evangelicalism is these are the words of Professor Schultz, a 20th century social movement that developed out of 19th century Protestant revivalism and that sought to Christianize the United States by converting as many people as possible and by securing recognition of Christianity as the dominant force in American culture. The core attributes of this movement have remained relatively unchanged since it emerged in the late 19th century. It was a flexible, pragmatic, market-driven faith that sought to make its message as appealing as possible. It emphasized the need for personal transformation, for making a new heart by accepting the sovereignty of Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit. And it was led by charismatic preachers who eschewed existing churches and built their own empires, close quote. The main thesis at the outset of the book concerning the vital period 1943 to 1991 is, quote, what changed is not evangelicalism itself, but its context, a quote from page 5. And the key parts of that context identified by Will are temporally the Cold War era and locatively Colorado Springs, Colorado. This introduction is framed at the end of the book by conclusion, the sanctuary, which emphasizes not continuity, but, to use a word very much in the air since Davos last week, rupture. Andrew Warmack, I quote, and the movement he represents, signified by his opening of Charis Bible College's new campus in Woodland Park, 20 miles from Colorado Springs in May 2021, and this is Will's words, seemed to mark a rupture in the history of American Protestantism, with post-World War II evangelicalism giving way to something new, more violent, more authoritarian, more open toward the supernatural, close quote. Indeed, the book ends on this note, another quote. The parachurch ministries that made Colorado Springs into Jesus Springs belong to another era, an era of uncontested American power, cultural conservatism, and religious dominance. That age is over, and so too is that stage in the history of evangelicalism. We now live in an era of democratic backsliding, cultural progressivism, and widespread secularization. This era will produce its own version of evangelical Christianity. What that will look like remains to be seen. Conclusion to the book, and pages 142 to 43. In my written response, I next give over 3 to 4 pages an analysis of the way in which each of the chapters will deftly raise the concerns that I've just named, each for a particular test case, either a place or people or focal point. Within this are all kinds of reverberations that come back. Winsomeness is the great new life, young life. Young life is all about winsomeness. And then Will say that Ted Haggard, before his disastrous fall, was known for his winsomeness, right? So this is like a symphony, and you need to listen because the oboe comes back in each chapter, right? So what I tried to do, both to set the stage for our conversation, to make sure I understood the book correctly, was I told back, in some sense, this is how I think the structure of the chapters work, and this is also, I think, how both the argument and the poetics of the argument are carried out. And you are very free to dispute where I may have misunderstood. Now I'm going to turn to some reflections on my own and a few questions that come out of my own particular scholarly and citizenly interests. Having summarized the argument of the book, I now turn to a few ruminations and questions for discussion. As I've mentioned, this book is very carefully composed in terms of its structure, with recurrent themes and constructs, examples and examples nicely balanced. It's also very well written on the paragraph level, often with arresting transitions that emphasize that what might have been expected from what came before was not, in fact, what happened. The historian confronts, of antiquity or modernity, the historian confronts again and again contingency and then the unexpected. And it's the work of historiography to write in such a way that the reader experiences it too. I did. Because of Will's self-conscious embrace of the poetics of the historiographic enterprise, I wanted to ask him about Hayden White's argument that all historiographic narratives they have various forms of arguments, one of which is plot. So I was asking, is this a comedy? Is this a romance? Is this a tragedy? Is this a satire? Does the book as a whole, and some of you, I teach that book in the Ancient Colloquium, so some of you are nodding with a Hayden White metahistory. But, does the book as a whole have a dominant plot structure? Do each of the chapters have such? Or, as others have noted before, is Hayden White's typology just too constricting? And would you want to go beyond it? But anyway, I did kind of like this little image of mine, that the reason I think it's not a comedy is that at least so far, evangelicalism and Colorado Springs, it's not a romance, that at least so far, evangelicalism and Colorado Springs didn't ride off together into the sunset. Or perhaps more fittingly, this is my favorite part, expect more fittingly, take off in an F-15. Awesome, right? Now that would be a romance. So anyway, the plot. And then secondly, I'm not going to read all this, but if you'd like to come back to this, I hear in Professor Schultz's writing an ironic sensibility. The way in which the examples and the counter-examples function seems to me to be deliberately ironic, in terms of there was not a spiritual NORAD was not created in Colorado Springs, even though the physical military NORAD was, right? So am I right? Is my colleague in some sense an ironist? And I don't mean, I don't think it's not satire. It's kind of rueful irony, I think I would say. And there are many such examples. I will name my own favorite, that I had never known, that the cadet's prayer invokes St. Francis. Make me an effective instrument of thy peace in the defense of the skies that canopy free nations. Oy vey. See, there's a tension in Jesus Springs, as in all historiographic work, between the identification of change and that of continuity. That's what we study as historians. As I mentioned earlier, Will uses the term rupture on the final pages of the book to refer to the 2020s and 2021 and up through 2024. But where is the big rupture? Is the rupture then, or was it in the 1990s? And I didn't see the word rupture in the 1990s, and there's not a Google version of your book, so I couldn't Google and see. But rupture is not a word in the index, so that's the rupture that I saw. So is that where the rupture is, or was it earlier? And would this press also that the evangelical change is not only in context, but also in content? And that's that fundamental distinction made already on page 5 of the book. So I want to ask about that. Another way to pose this question about the arc of the book is, how does the periodization work? Both in itself and as an explanatory tool. You were very smart not to include a timeline. Those are impossible to write, and they're always wrong or incomplete the minute you set them down. But how does it work? How does it work? Is the periodization from the early the first chapter between 1943 and 1991, is that the periodization of the whole book, or just the first and second chapters, in which case the others come after? But then what we find is that the 1990s are in some sense connecting with the earlier history, but this is the place where Will declares that the evangelicals decided that while they were with American society wasn't with them. So when did that happen? And why are we talking now about the 1990s per se? And so asking about the periodization, I ask, and what if the 90s are an era, what about the 1960s or the 1970s? Does blending those decades of the 60s and 70s into the Cold War era blunt or dissolve some of the particularity of significant and impactful events within them? I note, for example, that the index of the book contains no entries under civil rights, or on Martin Luther King Jr., women's rights, Vietnam War, Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, for instance. If the 1970s and the 60s and the 70s were their own player and not just subsumed in the Cold War era, what difference would that make? and what it would make to the way in which the story is told. This also raises what is perhaps the most pressing question, and I know it is one about which Will is most perspicacious. To what degree did the period that stands beyond your initial focus of 1943 to 91 affect your analysis of your core material, your selectivity of topics, your sources, and the way you wrote up your findings? It will certainly, of course, affect the way your book is read at this moment and in the future, as this critical history of evangelicals in America, which eventuates in its wedding itself to the Republican Party, is now unfolding in very significant and dangerous ways before our eyes. And the work of the historian is never done, as history as we know it is not over yet, at least for today. Although never mentioned in the book, Project 2025 and that infamous alumnus of the Wheaton of the Midwest, Russell Vogt, and his intellectual confrères in the Catholic world, such as Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame, so close by, hang over the present moment, and for this reader, especially this weekend, over your concluding chapter, like a cloud of tear gas. They both confirm and yet perhaps steamroll right over your statement on page 142 about, quote, the widespread belief among evangelicals that politics is the best way to restore Christianity to its former position of power in the United States. How did these American evangelicals get here? And what are they doing to our nation and world now? And to what end? 3 quick bullet points for ongoing discussion. The first has to do with the category not just of Christian nationalism, but of white Christian nationalism, and the treatment of race in the book. We can come back to that important question. Second, I was struck by the relative paucity of references to the Bible in the book. Now, that's a Guild thing, I know. But I think it's more than that. Only one explicit citation in the text that I found was Ephesians 6:12, one of your favorites, I know, and Daniel 10:13 in a footnote. I observed a few other unmarked biblical phrases and allusions, and I can give you my annotated version of the book with those. But my point isn't that formal one, or just an expression of a biblical scholar's myopia, so much as it is a genuine question about where is the Bible within these debates and disputes, as well as within your own analyses of them. I did go reread James Dobson on why I use fighting words in Christianity Today, 1995, because it's cited by you. And I noted, as I have with James Dobson before, that Dobson begins his defense for belligerent and demonizing rhetoric first with the hymns that he sang as a child, then with the very concept and institution of the Salvation Army, and only then with Scripture. But he piles on the Scripture, Exodus 15:3, I, Lord, Ish Milchama, man of war, etc., Psalm 144, etc., and of course he concludes with the ever-popular Ephesians 6:12, all cited in NIV translation. Well, my question to you, Will, is does the Bible play a pretty small role in your book? Because it's in fact become diminished in American evangelicalism over the last 80 years. Or perhaps, and I cite here an essay that was published by the Marty Center 20 years ago that I wrote on how biblical is the Christian right. Is it the case that the Christian right is subverting the Bible? The Bible's still there, but in its public platforms, it's a click or two away. It's not, so the word, and it's also been replaced by a new lexicon. Not the lexicon of fundamentalism or biblical inerrancy, but the lexicon of Christian worldview, of family values, and so on. Is that you? Is that me? So, at any rate, would you agree there are differences in the ways that evangelicals study in this book read and appealed to the Bible than their precursors in the early 20th century fundamentalism or in the 19th century? My last point, I have many other things of interest, but one thing that really I noticed about the list of evangelical organizations that moved to Colorado Springs. None of the main evangelical groups that address global hunger and poverty is included. World Vision, Bread for the World, Samaritan's Purse, Feed My Starving Children, all were founded between 1950 in 1987, but they don't move to Colorado Springs. Is this correct? And I guess you wrote me this morning, there is one that moved there, so I'd like to hear more about that. But has that received comment among evangelicals or scholars? What might it tell us about the evangelicals at Jesus Springs, that world hunger is not a represented concern? I have a footnote I'm dying to read, but we're out of time. So it remains to say thank you once again for the intellectual treat of learning with and from you in this book, Will. I much look forward to our conversation today and beyond, and I strongly encourage all present to add this very important book to your reading lists. Thank you.
Is that practice? And can everyone hear a day?
I'll do my best to be audible and legible and understandable and sensible, but really I can't promise to deliver on any of those last couple ones. Margie, thank you so much for this thorough, thoughtful engagement with what I did, or at least with what I tried to do. Your comment 3 years ago at the faculty retreat was extremely generative and helpful, and so I was glad to have the opportunity for an encore, for a repeat, which was as great as I expected. So much here that can be said. I'll try to address some of it as much as I can. And hopefully some of it, including that wonderful footnote you mentioned, will have the opportunity to come up in our conversation. The quick things I can say is that it is striking that very few of the evangelical organizations focused on poverty relief and hunger relief moved to Colorado Springs, with the notable exception of Compassion International, which is headquartered there now. That most of the organizations which move there are involved in media and education work rather than in social services. And the meaning of that, I'm not fully sure. It's something which I don't think I fully realized until you brought it up. And it's something I would like to reflect on more. My suspicion is that media and education-focused organizations have different needs in terms of just what they need in their headquarters, which may have led some to Colorado Springs and have kept the social service ones away. The Bible, what about the Bible? It's a good and critically important question. In part, this was shaped by the sources I looked at, many of which were evangelical publications directed at people who were not, or would likely not, consider themselves evangelicals. And in those kind of statements and that kind of rhetoric, biblical interpretation often gives way to a rhetoric of, as you said, Christian worldview, or, as I try to emphasize in the book, the culture war, as a frame, as a way of thinking about the world that glosses over the intricate theological questions of interpretation that have divided Christian traditions for so long, and instead try to gather everyone behind this assumed worldview or the flag of the culture war. But I hope we'll have a chance to talk more about that, as well as the question of whiteness, race, and racism, which looms large in Colorado Springs, sometimes if only by its absence from the conversation. For the broad points, when I read Hayden White's metahistory as a first-year graduate student, in history rather than religious studies, I reacted viscerally to it, not because I found it dull. I think it's actually, for a book called Meta History, it's surprisingly engaging, but because I found its argument about the telling of history as necessarily a form of plot and narration so wrong. It seemed to me on a gut level, like, no, the telling of history is not the same as the telling of a fictional story. I have much more sympathy for where White was coming from now that I've had to actually write a book and create a sort of plot for it. And indeed, sometimes you had the very nice compliment that this was a carefully constructed book. Sometimes I worry that I perhaps constructed it too carefully and sanded off a few too many rough edges, as are always there in history, in an effort to create that plot. And so again, Hayden White wins out in the end. It is, if anything, an ironic story, because Colorado Springs as Jesus Springs is an ironic place. No one meant to make Colorado Springs the center of evangelicalism. There was no point at which that was the plan of either the business people or the evangelical leaders. Not to say that it just happened. Countless decisions went into it, but it was not an intentional result. I think it's also worth thinking about the view of history embraced by many of the evangelical ideologues in Colorado Springs, for whom American history, which they see as also being Christian history, is, let's say, a tragedy always on the verge of becoming a romance. A tragedy, a tragic decline, with the possibility, with the opening of an uprising of the people, probably conceived, to return America, to bring them together in the final act, Christianity in America. Though I suppose there's an aspect of the comic to that, too, ending with a wedding. The periodization, with the point of how that spills over into the present, if it does at all. This is a place where one can cut at the joints too neatly. What I strove to get at was a sense of the shadow of the Cold War extending long beyond the actual end of the Cold War, that everyone involved in the important decisions in Colorado Springs, even after 1991, for several decades, were people who had been shaped by that context. Even if the war was over on a geopolitical level, they never fully gave it up in their minds. Certainly for someone like James Dobson, shaped by the Cold War context and always attentive to that Cold War fear of subversive ideas creeping into the American population through channels that we might be unaware of. He was a big fan of another Colorado Springs institution, Summit Ministries, which became famous for arguing that the Beatles were a pathway for communism to enter America, which, sounds laughable and is laughable in many ways, but reflected this ongoing fear, this fear of subversion, which did not end with the Cold War and continued into these eras of the culture wars. Now, whether the rupture between, what evangelicalism is now and what it was, let's say, in the era of Billy Graham in the 40s and 50s, did that rupture happen now? Did it happen in the 1990s? That's something I don't know if I have a good answer to yet. I do, there's something that I've been thinking about, trying to articulate, is thinking about Trumpism and the MAGA movement as a sort of revival movement within American Christianity. The sort of revival that, say, earlier Christian evangelists hoped and prayed for in the United States. And I think the contours of that sort of revivalist religion, mapping those contours, is the work that is being done by many great journalists and scholars today, and that I am trying to connect to the story told here. We were talking, before about the comments by self-identified evangelicals and evangelical institutions on events in Minneapolis, the murder of Alex Pretty and Renee Good, and the violence surrounding that. And there are some muted voices of condemnation. Some of the older evangelical institutions and leaders have expressed perhaps discomfort, but there are new clique of ideologues who are much more likely to be preaching about resisting the sin of empathy, right? And talking about toxic empathy and the need to harden your hearts against these claims and against what you were seeing in Minneapolis, which, certainly in the long sweep of Christianity, which I will not pretend to be an expert on, you have similar moments of cruelty and violence, to say the least. I do feel that what we see now is different in significant ways from at least the language of winsomeness expressed by Jim Rayburn and Dawson Trotman and even James Dobson at some points. But it's something I'm still working through and something I, would love to keep in dialogue with you about. Because again, I think all of this needs to be understood in the sweep of the history of the Christian tradition. We like, and by necessity lop off certain time periods, but it's never a clean break. I could, rather than go on through these kind of winding channels, I'll stop here. Thank you again for your thoughts, and open it up to the audience for questions, comments, really anything at all you'd like to talk about with this book or with the wider questions that Margie raised. In the back there?
Thanks so much. That was fascinating. And I'm really looking forward now to reading the book. So you sold it very well, at least to the listener. I had a weird question from the perspective of a historian of Protestantism before 1800. And so very much ignorant of anything that happened in what I think of as modernity. 1801 onwards. But my question is, from that perspective, one of the most striking things about kind of 2020s evangelicalism is actually its relationship to Catholicism. That's very, very different from the type of Protestantism that I'm used to dealing with, as well as the type of Protestantism for which, in a kind of very deep theological sense, evangelicalism is often very now. And I'm kind of curious to hear whether your story tells us anything about what laid the foundations for that reconfiguration of the relationship between evangelicalism and Catholicism, especially because a couple of things that Margie said and that you kind of said as well brought this to mind, like particularly terms like Evangelical Vatican. Actually, that recession of scripture I found really interesting in this respect as well. The allusion, I couldn't quite catch the order of allusion or recitation or reference, but the kind of whatever it was to St. Francis. And then also even the language, when I moved, you described the US Naval Academy's chapel as an icon or something like that. And that also brought to mind actually how evangelicalism has a radically different aesthetic to its earlier forms of Protestantism, but also again it seemed to point towards laying the groundwork for this reconfiguration. I know it's a little bit outside of the kind of main focus of the book, but I was wondering if kind of there's anything there, essentially. I was just curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much for that question. And there's many things there. So thank you for bringing it up. Indeed, one of the original of the many titles that this book went through was the Evangelical Vatican, which, as Professor Mitchell said, is one of the names often applied to Colorado Springs. But the good people at University of North Carolina Press, who are really wonderful people, said, well, if you call it that, everyone will think it's a book about Catholicism. They'll finish it and be like, well, where was the Vatican? Which is a fair point. So even if this is a story primarily about evangelicalism, the alliances they were able to forge with like-minded Catholics is a very significant part of this story. The language of culture war was an important factor in bringing that rapprochement about. The idea that we are all on the same side in this struggle against, and here's an interesting point. A significant trope in the evangelical rhetoric is attacking opponents as false forms of religion. That it's not simply about targeting liberalism or the gay rights movement or feminism as political movements. The refrain is that these are Christian heresies, or that they are false or perverted religions, and hence we are in a culture war with them. And so in this landscape of competing religions, Catholicism no longer seems, at least in the United States, the urgent threat it once did. So again, the idea of conjuring up opposing religions is, I think, another thing which allows for that that alliance to grow. The last thing I note is a very interesting phenomenon, which is that in this evangelical movement, the intellectual firepower is provided by Catholics, by and large. That, for instance, when Amendment 2, which is an anti-gay rights law in Colorado, goes to court, the expert witnesses who are brought in to testify about the evils of homosexuality are Catholic thinkers like Robert George. And so the kind of architectonic theories of natural law, which these intellectuals are able to provide, are extraordinarily appealing to evangelical movement leaders who are seeking a way to justify their activism in putatively secular language. And natural law in some way provides that, right? You know, you don't explicitly talk about the Bible. So, and again, I think that's a phenomenon that deserves further exploration, the relationship between evangelical activists and Catholic intellectuals in particular. So I don't think I've had a straightforward answer to the question, but perhaps I've laid out some points which made that alliance easier.
Can I just join and say I think it's in the book, and it's a larger topic though, but it's strategic ecumenism. Right, it's strategic ecumenism, which it's similar to also not pressing on doctrinal differences among Protestant sectarianism, right? So you create a kind of larger dome in which there's agreement. There's also the old principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's really, in many ways, how I think the Catholic-Protestant dynamic has worked. And it is also, I mean, it's in the book, but abortion and sexuality are the two crucial places where they find commonality to me. And so those are the identification points. I would just add, though, to Professor McFarland's point that this is one of the reasons that, for me, as someone who works more in the ancient period, like, this idea of that the opponents are not just wrong, but they are fake versions of the truth. Yeah. This is very, very old. I mean, this is 2 Corinthians 11. This is the false apostles. These are the false brothers. They're not just false. They're false prophets, Jeremiah says, right? Jeremiah 26:28, right? So they look like they are doing the right thing, but they're the opposite of what they are. That's deep and within Scripture and the early Christian tradition. And so they're reviving. So this is why it's hard for me to say there's a rupture when I see something that's already marrow in the bones, in some sense. Now, each generation is responsible for what of the tradition they choose to pick up and appropriate at any given moment. That's the task of civilization. That's the task of tradition, of people who claim to stand within a tradition. But why they choose that rather than other things that could have been chosen? Because there's also in that same scripture and tradition, there are indeed profound calls for unity. Yeah. So, anyway, I just wanted to join that conversation and say that the strategic ecumenism between the evangelicals and the Catholics is so fascinating. And also, last of all, they think the Vatican is the most false. Right? So the idea that Evangelical Vatican is a positive thing, right? I mean, do you see in the literature people like saying, that's the last thing we want to be is a Vatican. That's the palace of Satan, right? I mean,
yeah, it's noteworthy that it is generally not evangelicals who are saying, we live in the Evangelical Vatican. For, I think, even if that, the most explicit forms of anti-Catholicism have been shorn away, there's not, at least publicly, talking about, the Scarlet or Rome, but the Vatican, or the phrase that other people use, evangelical Mecca, like you can imagine they're not embracing that one either. Little Wheaton of the West is one that sits much more comfortably on their tongues. For those of you who are not familiar with it, Wheaton is a suburban community in Chicago, home to Wheaton College, one of the most important evangelical institutions, set of a wonderful collection of evangelical archives, and home to some darn good ice cream. So that point of comparison is a much easier one.
Yeah. But Wheaton is an educational institution, and it's not the same thing as the Vatican. Right? I mean, in terms of what it means to be a capital of something.
The sense that, the commands are emerging from here. Yeah. And I think, evangelicals in Colorado Springs, at least their leaders, sometimes struggled with, well, I should also say journalists often struggled with the question of how to interpret that. There is, I think, this continual search, not only in Colorado Springs, but elsewhere, for who is the evangelical pope? Who is the guy who we talk to who will be who will give us the lowdown on what evangelicals actually believe?
But they could have said Geneva or Wittenberg.
You're giving them a lot of credit. I don't want to be unfair, but those are certainly the more natural comparisons.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'd love to give actually stand up with.
Do you want?
No. I wanted, as kind of an extension of this question, the conversation, so you bring up Mecca. I'm interested in, if you could speak about sort of what other forms of othering are going on, maybe vis-a-vis other religious traditions. I'm really interested in hearing that, particularly considering, I think, you bring up Robbie George. He's, in the last maybe 2 decades, really made a lot of effort in bringing in other religious traditions into this fold of kind of sort of cross-traditions efforts towards whatever it is he's doing. So he has strong alliances with Muslim leaders and Jewish leaders, right, who are kind of interested maybe in similar forms of advocacy. So I'm interested, do you see that in the case study that you're doing? What's the, relation to and image of other religious traditions rather than just all the food?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful, really helpful question. So you see multiple forms of that. The demonology is a place where you see essentially the rankest forms of bigotry among advocates of spiritual warfare. The idea of battling demons through these intense and public prayers. Just as a note for everyone, at the end of this week, the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th, we have a conference here in the Swift Hall on global Christianity, which we'll talk more about, among other things, the traditions of spiritual warfare. So I hope to see some of you there. But the assumption in much of the spiritual warfare literature consumed and in some cases published in Colorado Springs is that, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, they are all true to some degree, but they are all evil, right? All of these things the things they talk about are real, but these are demonic forces rather than heavenly forces, and thus have to be combated. And there are these folks in Colorado Springs, this is the harder edge of the movement, who talk about things like going to Tibet and climbing the Himalayas and praying at the top of one of the mountains there to break the power of Buddhist spirits. There is very much this rolling of the action movie aesthetic into the language of Christianity. Now, offsetting that literal demonization of other religious traditions, you have something very different on the ground in Colorado Springs, where less combative evangelical institutions who are in some ways eager to shed their city's reputation as a place of intolerance and their religion's reputation as a religion of intolerance do try to cultivate local connections with non-Christian groups. It's very limited and very hesitant, but I think it demonstrates an important divide here, which is the sort of bombastic rhetoric being exported from Colorado Springs about civilizational warfare, about demons, and about the way that the religion is actually lived out in the homes and cities, in the homes and streets and businesses of Colorado Springs. So all of which is to say, on the political level, it's still very much a Christian movement with occasional nods toward Judaism. But the social history of Colorado Springs, which this does not pretend to be a full social history, I think would show something a little more complicated. And certainly a city more diverse than homogenous evangelicalism.
Just two quick points on that. I mean, one is there are some pages in the book about reactions to 9/11 and very, very severe anti-Islam arguments and rhetoric and statements. And I would just say, I think subsequent events have shown an intertwining of that with some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric in the United States, right? And so the concern about Islam and concern about the immigrant, that's also in an interesting, strange relationship with what's going on in Europe as well, vis-a-vis immigration from North Africa and from Syria and from the East. So there's an oddity there. In terms of Robert George, one institution that I watch just as a citizen and someone interested in the way this plays out is the Religious Freedom Institute, and that's Robert George is a major player in that, and that's also what I would call, and this isn't only a negative phrasing, but I'm going to use it again, strategic ecumenism. And in that case, what is the strategy is that you combine that we are all persecuted in our respective religious traditions in order that we together may have more clobber power over against those who really were worried about, which are the secularists who are against religion altogether. So whether that is a kind of ecumenism of mutual respect, or whether it's a strange bedfellows in service of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, we could have more conversation about that. I would welcome that. But at any rate, I read that literature from the Religious Freedom Institute, and I see the way in which I think it's predominantly Christian, but that it's incorporating Muslims, Jews, and others under this flag of persecuted religion.
I have a question about one of the terms from the subtitle that hasn't sort of been talked about, which is capitalism. And so it's not just about evangelicals, but about evangelical capitalism. And I think this pertains to Professor Mistral's questions about periodization and a sense of rupture, positivist. And so I'm curious about the place of evangelical capitalism in the period that we cover to sort of the interests of American capitalism writ large in the context of the Cold War. So a certain connection between religion and capitalism and against communism. And whether or not that context is part of a context that changes, then I'm sort of going to again, like, does evangelical capitalism's relationship to American capitalism change in the 90s? And therefore there's a rupture? Or what happens to evangelical capitalism to the start of that, like you saw?
Thank you so much. Because you're right, that is, we put it in the subtitle, and it is worth thinking about what it means and what its significance is. What I hope to convey in the term evangelical capitalism is the way that evangelicalism for much of the 20th century in the United States is dependent on a certain dynamic of developing relationships and transforming those relationships into resources, including financial resources, which can then be plowed back into the into the project of developing more relationships. And this might sound a crude and overly economistic way of talking about it, but these leaders are quite clear-eyed about the interrelationship of personal friendships and donating money. You know, they see those as one and the same, and they see money as something with a significant theological charge, a significant theological meaning, as something which will allow them to build the kingdom of God. And in the Cold War, in Colorado Springs, there is a sanctification of the workings of the free market, in the sense that, success in that world of competitive fundraising is read as God's providence smiling upon the work that you are doing. And it is only a short step, I think, from rationalizing or understanding your own financial success as providence to seeing the workings of the capitalist market more generally as, again, a case of providence working in the world. And so in that sense, the evangelical capitalism, as it exists in Colorado Springs, serves to buttress capitalism more broadly. The relationship becomes more tangled in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s when corporate institutions, some of them become more, let's say, sensitive about progressive social issues. Some become more willing to take public stands on it, which contemporary complaints about woke capital on the right, go back decades, even if they don't use the phrase woke. There is this, in the 1990s in Colorado Springs, evangelical groups complained bitterly about the feeling that they have been abandoned by large corporations. Disney is a particular favorite target. And again, that goes back to the question of subversion, right? That things like Disney are actually sending messages to our kids which we would not want them to hear. On the flip side, there's, critiquing specific capitalist institutions almost never bleeds over into a broader critique. And many of these groups are happy to celebrate capitalism in all its varieties well into the 21st century. Ted Haggard, the pastor of New Life Church, is kind of the perfect example of this. He talks about the wonders of the religious free market as a way of growing religion. He even says, just as Baskin-Robbins has 32 flavors of ice cream to suit everyone's taste, so Christianity needs 32 flavors to, make sure everyone is catered to, which is, in some ways, it seems a strange way of thinking about it, right? But I do think that it is just a continuation of this broader idea of we live in a religious marketplace that mirrors the economic marketplace, and that is the way that it ought to be. So even the critiques of progressivism among businesses are not enough to shake that confidence.
I really agree. I think the thread of capitalism, it is shown even more in the earlier chapters with the acquisition of property, the tax code, sort of basic sort of things. And then you get the astounding figure that Dobson's headquarters cost $30 million. And you didn't quite follow the money, but where does that come from? But then there's this image that you paint, really beautiful, the very graphic image of Haggard's sort of cathedral of prayer. What is the name of it?
The World Prayer Center.
The World Prayer Center. But there's money attached, right? People send money with those prayer requests, don't they?
Yes.
I mean, so the other part that's maybe could be developed, and I'm sure one of our colleagues, Professor Adela Kuhn, works on this as well, but just to what degree is this capital, they're offering a religious service and they're getting money on the dollar for it, right? So you write in for help with your emphysema and you send your $5 or your $10 or whatever. And that's there in your chapter 5. I don't think it's your main point.
I think it's part of the broader, and again, this is not in any way uniquely evangelical, but I think has been perfected among many evangelical institutions, is that cultivating of the personal relationship, in which money is one expression of that. And Dobson, Focus on the Family, was just a champion of that. He knew and worked hard to connect with people, a connection that was kind of ironically made possible by his employees, many of whom were underpaid women married to service members in Colorado Springs.
Would you argue, though, that part of that emphasis on friendship is a way to blunt a kind of naked transactionalism? That there's a worry that it really could look quid pro quo too much. So instead, it's within it's within friendship, not just business.
In a word, yes. I think that is exactly what is happening there, and is something that's recognized in the literature. And this is part of, I've been kind of working on a project now about religion and financial fraud, studying it, not committing it. And what strikes me there is that for all of these cases, there's just this tremendous fear of being seen as too transactional. And the groups that are targeted are those who do not, for various reasons, who are not able to obscure that necessary transaction. Because I do think, again, religion always has a sort of transactional aspect to it, but in some places and times, it is better obscured, obfuscated, explained. Don had his hand up in the back.
So, Professor Schultz, I think we first had a conversation about your book 3 years ago when I was still prospective. And I mentioned I was from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and you said that was another city that perhaps may have competed for your research topic that you mentioned earlier. And I'm curious as to, we can make a case for Grand Rapids, Michigan, maybe Tennessee, Kansas, or even Southern California, Orange County. But our job as historians of religion is not to advocate for this city and this region is the best example of American evangelicalism. So what advantages and risks are there when you write a whole book focusing on one city or one region?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that. So Grand Rapids, with its connections to Amway and so many other, religious institutions, you could write, and I hope someone will write, a really good book about that. And if it does already exist, please tell me. The danger of focusing on Colorado Springs, or really focusing on any particular place, is the danger of buying into hype/fear. Because as I try to get across in the book, Evangelical Vatican obscures a much more complex reality. And that Evangelical Vatican, well, in some ways a reality, is also a media creation. Part of this search for what is the capital of evangelicalism? Where is the Pope? Where are the orders coming from? And I wanted to avoid giving the image that, as some activists said of Colorado Springs in the 1990s, that it was a, quote, right-wing Death Star. That's not what it was. And if we think about it in those terms, we misunderstand not only Colorado Springs, but we also misunderstand evangelicalism more broadly, which has, while authority and authoritarianism is a significant part of evangelicalism, so too is this very decentralized nature. The advantage of, say, looking at one place rather than doing, say, a family portrait of Colorado Springs and Grand Rapids and Virginia Beach and San Diego and Dallas, part of it is practical, right? That would take a while. And I've needed to finish the book and wanted to finish the book. But on a more intellectual and I think more important level, looking at a particular place allows us to see the individual dynamics and decisions which made this place possible. To both take the Evangelical Vatican label, but then undermine, complicate, and expand upon it. Only by looking at a single place can, I think, you really explore that intertwining of myth and reality, and to see how the reality becomes the myth and how the myth then in turn has an impact on the reality. I don't think I could have done that with a sort of group portrait, even if I'd had 20 years to do it. So it's not just a question of needing to finish in time. But thank you for bringing up that potential point of comparison.
And it bears mentioning as well that a key part of the book is also placelessness. I mean, I mentioned that in my remarks, and maybe that's why the Christian ministries that are there are mostly communication media.
Yeah.
Because there's a way in which their rootedness in Colorado Springs doesn't determine the limits of their impact, that they're actually seeking an impact certainly America, but also globally. But so that's one of the other ironies of the book is that Colorado Springs, the place is really important, but it's actually a network that doesn't only exist in Colorado Springs.
Wouldn't
I've understood you.
Yeah, you could compare it to Silicon Valley, which is both a place, an embodied place with people, and is also this broader both network and ideology. It would be a little bit of an exaggeration to say Colorado Springs was the evangelical Silicon Valley, but there are aspects of the story where it's like that.
Jan, we are getting toward the end. I didn't want to sort of Professor Jellicoe, if you wanted to say something quickly.
Yeah, this is a last question about the international missionary movement of this church, like whether it's like the international missionaries that we managed from Colorado Springs and which part of the world they go, and how is that affect, the holy missions across the regions? Because the period that you talked about the Cold War was really great for the American evangelization of the war. So again, what left from around Sweden from Sweden?
Yeah. The people in Colorado Springs, the evangelical leaders in Colorado Springs, are very self-conscious that they are not just in the middle of an American network, they're in the middle of an international network. And there is, let's say, a crude economic aspect of moving to Colorado Springs because it's easier for them to reach out to the world that way. They can save money by moving and then plow more of that money into this kind of mission work abroad. There is this peculiar mix of cosmopolitanism and xenophobia in many of the evangelical institutions in Colorado Springs because they are quite aware of the rest of the world in a way that many Americans are not, are deeply conscious of what's going on in at least areas of strong missionary activity. But going back to Professor Duran's question, that is often coupled with a strong sense of, at best, paternalism. And this is where I think the issue of racism comes in as well, that there are these people, and this can include both people abroad, but also, African Americans in inner cities, who we have the responsibility to care for and uplift. And Colorado Springs is part of projecting that way of relating with the world, a way of, let's say, a sense of strong moral responsibility shading over into guardianship for these other communities. So that is, I think, through much of this story, and, not all groups are quite so insensitive about it. Many are taking much more active steps to rethink that way. But I think that was, for much of the time, the default understanding of the world.